The story was posted at Reddit subforum Creepypasta by user Creepy Stories Jr. Title: Night Shift at Harrington's Gas Station. I'd never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, all that stuff, none of it had ever held much sway over me. But after my first night as a security guard at this 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town, I wasn't so sure anymore. It was supposed to be an easy gig, a late-night job to pay the bills. Nothing more than keeping an eye on the place, handling the occasional drunk driver or rowdy teen, and making sure no one wandered too far into the parking lot. At least, that's what I thought when I applied. The pay was decent, the hours quiet, and the isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. The gas station itself wasn't much to look at, a dingy building that sat at the edge of a long, winding road that seemed to stretch into nothing. The main attraction was the bright fluorescent lights that flickered above the pumps and cast long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, it was just as unimpressive. Aisles of chips and snacks, a small refrigerator stocked with energy drinks and sodas, and a counter where my co-worker, Ray, sat behind the register. Ray was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, and had the look of a man who'd spent too many years on the night shift. His skin was pale, his hair thinning, and his eyes had that glazed over, distant look that made me wonder if he ever really slept. He'd been at the gas station for years, or so he told me on my first night, and he didn't say much else unless he had to. Tonight, as I clocked in and grabbed my flashlight, Ray was sitting behind the counter, sipping from a cup of coffee and staring out into the parking lot. He nodded at me when I came in but didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. "How's the night been so far?" I asked, trying to make some small talk. Ray took a long sip of his coffee before answering, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "Quiet, just how I like it." "Anything I should know about?" I asked, settling in for what I thought would be an uneventful night. Ray's eyes flicked toward me, then back to the parking lot. "Yeah, actually," he said slowly, "there are a few things you should know. Rules, mostly, the kind that'll keep you out of trouble." I raised an eyebrow. "Rules, like what?" Ray glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was listening, then leaned in a bit closer. "I'll tell you about them through the night," he said. "It's easier that way. Some things you just need to experience to understand." I was about to ask him what he meant when he added, "And one more thing, don't ask too many questions." The night passed slowly. The hours seemed to drag on, and apart from the occasional car pulling in to fill up, nothing much happened. I made my rounds around the parking lot, checked the perimeter, and kept an eye on the pumps. Ray stayed behind the counter, always watching, always sipping his coffee. It wasn't until around 1 a.m. when Ray suddenly cleared his throat. "There's something you need to know about," he said, his voice low and serious. "First rule." I stopped mid-step and turned toward him. "Yeah?" "If you see a little boy come in," Ray continued, "around 7 or 8 years old, wearing a red jacket, don't talk to him. Don't even acknowledge him, just let him do what he does and leave. He comes around sometimes, usually late at night. But whatever you do, don't speak to him. If he asks you for help, ignore him." I stared at Ray, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. He was dead serious. "What happens if I talk to him?" I asked. Ray didn't look at me. "You don't want to know," he muttered. I didn't press him further, but the thought of a little boy wandering around the gas station in the middle of the night was unsettling enough. A few hours later, after another lull in activity, Ray spoke up again. "Second rule," he said, without looking at me. I was restocking the drinks in the cooler, and I stopped, listening. "Stay out of the shadows," Ray continued. "If the lights flicker and go out, stay where it's lit. Don't walk into the dark corners. You might see things moving in the dark, shadows that don't belong to anything. Whatever you do, don't follow them. They'll lead you somewhere you can't come back from." I glanced out the window at the flickering parking lot lights. They were old, barely working half the time. but Ray's tone made me uneasy. "Have you seen the shadows?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Ray shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Once or twice. Don't care to see them again." Around 3 a.m., the gas station was completely silent. No customers, no cars, just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I was getting restless when Ray spoke up again. "Third rule," he said. "That door in the back of the station. The one marked, employees only. Don't open it, don't knock on it, don't go near it, just ignore it. It's better that way." I frowned, looking toward the back of the station. There was a door there, old and scratched up, with a faded sign that read, "Employees only." I hadn't paid much attention to it before. "What's behind it?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew Ray's answer. "Don't know, don't care to find out," Ray replied. "But sometimes you'll hear noises coming from back there. Scratching, tapping, maybe even voices. Ignore it, the door stays closed." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. The hours dragged on. It was nearing 4 a.m., and fatigue was starting to set in. The hum of the gas station's lights, the soft hum of the refrigerator units, and Ray's occasional cryptic advice were all that kept me company. That's when Ray hit me with the fourth rule. "Last thing you need to know for now," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "The light in the parking lot, the big one near the pumps, make sure it stays on. If it goes out, you need to fix it right away." I raised an eyebrow. "What happens if it goes out?" Ray set his coffee cup down and gave me a hard look. "If it goes out, they'll come. And you don't want them coming." I didn't ask who they were. Sometime after 4 a.m., the gas station felt wrong. I was stocking shelves when I noticed Ray wasn't behind the counter anymore. I hadn't seen him leave or heard him move. It was as if he had vanished. "Ray," I called out, stepping toward the counter. No answer. I looked around the gas station, checking the aisles, the bathrooms, and even the perimeter outside. But there was no sign of him. The back door remained shut, the shadows in the far corners of the station dark and foreboding. I felt a rising sense of dread. Ray was nowhere to be found. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and a chill crept up my spine. Suddenly, I remembered one of the rules, the shadows. I stayed under the fluorescent lights, avoiding the dark corners, my heart racing. I didn't know if I'd broken a rule by looking for him, but something told me I had. The parking lot light flickered. My stomach lurched, and I sprinted outside, fumbling with the switch on the side of the building. After a few agonizing seconds, the light sputtered back to life. The parking lot bathed in that familiar glow, and I exhaled, my hands shaking. When I went back inside, Ray was there, sitting behind the counter like he'd never left. "Where the hell did you go?" I demanded, my voice louder than I'd intended. "I couldn't find you anywhere." Ray didn't look up from his coffee. "You shouldn't have looked for me." "What?" "That's the last rule," he said, his voice low and tired. "If I disappear, don't look for me. The thing that comes back won't be me. Don't talk to it, don't acknowledge it, just pretend it's not there." I stared at him, my blood running cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ray finally looked up at me, his eyes empty, devoid of any emotion. "You broke the rule." My heart pounded in my chest, confusion and fear swirling inside me. Was he messing with me? How could this thing be telling me not to talk to it if it wasn't Ray? I backed away slowly, my mind racing. If this wasn't Ray, then what was it? Why would it warn me about itself? The shadows in the corners of the station seemed to shift, growing darker, stretching toward me. The parking lot light flickered again, and this time, I didn't move. I was frozen, caught between disbelief and terror. It was like the shadows were alive, moving, slithering, coiling closer and closer. My mind raced, screaming at me to stay in the light, to follow Ray's rules. But my legs felt like lead, my body unwilling to respond as the darkness seemed to wrap itself around the corners of the store. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, like the station itself was groaning under the weight of something unseen. The flickering of the parking lot light became more erratic, casting brief, harsh flashes across the interior. In the back of my mind, I remembered what Ray had said about the lights: if they go out, they'll come. You don't want them coming. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. My body jerked into action as I ran for the switch that controlled the parking lot lights. My fingers fumbled with the old, rusted lever on the wall, and for a moment, my heart nearly stopped as I realized it wasn't working. The hum intensified, and the shadows seemed to surge forward, creeping across the floor like liquid night. With a desperate grunt, I yanked the switch harder. The parking lot light sputtered back to life, bright and glaring, chasing the shadows back into the corners. I collapsed against the wall, panting, my heart hammering against my ribcage. The light was on, and the shadows had retreated, but the station didn't feel any safer. I could still feel them, watching, waiting for the light to fail again. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me wondered if the light was the only thing holding him back. And then there was Ray, or whatever was pretending to be him, sitting behind the counter, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. The weight of his final rule sat heavily on my mind. The thing that comes back won't be me. Don't talk to it, don't acknowledge it. Was this really happening? Had I broken the rule, or had Ray, or the thing wearing his skin, lied to me? My hands trembled as I stood there, staring at him. It felt like a twisted game. He had returned, informed me of a rule that might not even apply anymore, and then gone back to his coffee like none of it mattered. I took a few shaky steps forward, and that's when the next event happened. A soft chime echoed through the gas station. The door had opened. I hadn't seen it move, there hadn't been a car pulling up to the pumps, but when I turned around, I saw him. The boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, just like Ray had described. His red jacket stood out in the dim fluorescent glow of the station, too bright, too vivid for the otherwise washed-out world of the night. He stood by the door, looking around as if lost, his eyes wide and pleading. Every instinct screamed at me to help him. It didn't feel right, just standing there, pretending he wasn't there, pretending I didn't hear the quiet sniffle of a child trying to hold back tears. But Ray's warning burned in the back of my mind: if you see a boy in a red jacket, don't talk to him. Don't acknowledge him. The boy took a few tentative steps into the store, his small hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. He was looking right at me. "Mister," his voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Can you help me? I can't find my mom." My throat tightened. I glanced at Ray, or whatever was pretending to be him. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted at all to the boy's presence. It was like he couldn't even see him. The boy took another step closer. "Please, I'm scared." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to follow the rule. My pulse raced, my mind fighting between the human instinct to help a child and the primal fear that told me something was deeply wrong. The temperature in the station seemed to drop, the fluorescent lights buzzing ominously overhead. My hands trembled as I focused on keeping still. The boy sniffled again. "Why won't you help me?" His voice was louder now, almost accusatory. "Please." Tears welled in his wide eyes, and he reached out toward me. That's when I saw it, the flicker, the momentary slip. His face didn't change at first, but in the dim light, I saw his eyes flash, just for a second, with something that wasn't human. Something cold and hollow. The smile that had started to creep across his lips was wrong, too wide, too sharp. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The boy let out a soft whimper, his face contorting with mock sadness. "Why won't you help me?" His voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of a child anymore. There was something deeper, something older beneath it. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls of the station. I turned away, refusing to look at him, ignoring the chill that crept down my spine as his footsteps echoed softly across the floor. The sound of his movement grew quieter until, finally, the door chimed again. He was gone. I leaned against the counter, my nerves frayed, my mind racing. Ray, or the thing that looked like Ray, sat there watching me. He didn't say anything about the boy, just sipped his coffee, his eyes distant and glazed. I glanced toward the back of the store, where the employees-only door loomed like a dark shadow at the end of the hallway. I hadn't noticed it before tonight, but now, it felt like the focal point of everything wrong in this place. The faintest sound reached my ears, a soft scratching, barely audible over the hum of the station's lights. My heart skipped a beat. Ray had warned me about the door. Don't open it, don't knock, don't go near it. But the sound continued, persistent and unsettling. It wasn't just scratching anymore, there was a faint tapping, like knuckles against wood. A soft, rhythmic knock. My feet felt glued to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't even look away from the door. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't supposed to go near it. But something was there. Something was behind that door, and every second that passed felt like it was pulling me toward it. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. I exhaled, the tension in my chest easing just slightly, but then, the door creaked. It wasn't much, just the faintest movement, as if someone had leaned against it from the other side. The knob didn't turn, the door didn't open, but it moved. A voice, quiet and low, drifted through the door. "Let me out." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, muffled, but it was unmistakable. Someone, something, was behind that door. Ray's warning echoed in my mind, "The door stays closed." I turned back toward the front of the store, but Ray, if that was even still him, hadn't moved. He stared ahead blankly, as if oblivious to the sounds, oblivious to me. The door creaked again, and the voice grew louder. "Please, let me out." My legs moved on instinct. I bolted for the front of the station, my mind screaming at me to get away from that door, to get as far from it as I could. I made my way to the front door, taking in gulps of the cold night air as soon as I stepped outside. The parking lot lights flickered above me, but this time, I wasn't going to leave them unchecked. I couldn't afford another close call with the shadows. I couldn't afford anything else. I stayed close to the lights, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear, my mind swirling with questions. Who, or what was behind that door? What had happened to Ray? And was the thing behind the counter really him? And why had the boy looked at me like that, with those cold, hollow eyes? The sky began to lighten just slightly. Dawn wasn't far off. I just had to make it through the night. But as I stood there, keeping my eyes on the station's entrance, something else started to feel wrong. The fluorescent lights inside the store flickered, just for a second, but long enough for me to see it. Ray wasn't sitting behind the counter anymore. The chair was empty. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I scanned the parking lot. There was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. I turned back toward the store, trying to make sense of it all. And then the door creaked open behind me. Slowly, cautiously, I turned around. Ray, or something that looked like him, stood in the doorway, staring at me with a blank expression. His eyes were glassy, distant, his skin pale. He didn't move, didn't speak. I froze, remembering the last rule he'd given me. Don't talk to it, don't acknowledge it. My mouth went dry. This wasn't Ray. It couldn't be. But if it wasn't, then what was it doing there? And why had it come back? It took a step toward me, and I backed away, keeping my eyes on the figure. It wasn't him. It couldn't be him. The sun's first rays finally broke over the horizon, the pale light spilling into the parking lot. I kept my distance, edging toward my car, refusing to take my eyes off the figure standing in the gas station's doorway. The night was over. I had made it through. But as I drove away, Leaving the gas station behind, the feeling of unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought, if that thing wasn't Ray, why did it tell me the rules? And more importantly, what else was it hiding from me? That was my last night at the gas station. And I don't plan on ever going back.